So this network meeting, so this is a special one in that it's introducing a new food standard code, and it's talking to you about what that food standard code means for schools around Queensland, particularly Tuckshops. And what do you, I guess the other thing that comes under this, I guess, with food safety is also the compliance around training. And this would apply to everyone who has a food safety supervisor certificate across the state. So we'll talk about that as well. So really, this is the new standard. It's 3.2.2.8, and it's called the Food Safety Management Plan. And this is all about breaking it down really into management tools. So that's probably the big thing. That's so 3.2.2 did exist previously under the Food Standards Code, but it's this point A, which is the new element of it. And so they've kind of provided some tools now on what that actually required from a food safety management point of view. And the reason they've done that is because nationally, not every state was following the same rules and regulations, I guess, within their own state. So they're trying to nationalise and standardise how food safety is dealt with across all the different jurisdictions. So the big thing to note is that for Queensland, we have always had some level of Food Act requirements and standards that we've complied to or been required to comply to. Some states haven't. So there are bigger changes afoot for other states like Western Australia, Northern Territory, South Australia. So there are new requirements in there that are happening, and I'll talk about those in a second. But for Queensland, it's pretty much situation as normal. So if you've been currently exempt under the Food Safety Act, then you still will be exempt. It's just about within this section, it's about understanding these are the new requirements if you do need to comply with the Food Safety Act. Now, before we go on any further, I'm really keen to hear from who here is from a non-state school. If you can pop it in the chat, that would be amazing.
We are from non-state school, independent school, BBC.
Yep, excellent. So Moray Field, your state school. Diana, you're an independent. School. Yep, your state school. And Diana, you're a non-state school, aren't you? I think she's listening. But yes, I know that she is, so that's fine. And Kim, let me just check. You're at, is it Graceville? Is that the one, I think, Kim? Or is it Yungum? Oh, sorry, Yungumby.
Yeah, are you there? Sorry, are you there, Donna?
Yes, I'm here.
Yeah, sorry. Christ the King Graceville. It's Catholic Ed, Brisbane Catholic Ed.
Yeah. Okay. So, well, that's good because there are different, and there's different things that apply to state schools and non-state schools. So I'm going to walk you through what the changes are first, and then I'll walk through the different changes for the different schools. So that's good. So we've got a broad spectrum today, which is helpful. So these food safety management tools apply to any food service business, Category 1 or Category 2 under the Food Safety Act. So the key changes are, guys, it's basically a food management system needs to be in place using 3 tools. And they say that in place means that if you have these three tools in place, then they will deem that you've got a food management system in place. So the first one is a food handler training, food safety supervision, and also record management. So they're the 3 tools that this new, I guess, standard is focusing on. Different businesses have, and different schools and tuck shops have different requirements. So not-for-profits are different to for-profit schools, and we'll talk about that in a second as well. Now, in terms of the Category 1 and Category 2, I like to just sort of use this as a bit of a going back to 101 for tuck shops. So 95% of the tuck shops that we deal with, we would say are Category 1 food businesses, not a Category 2. And the easiest way to look at it is a Category 2 is really more like a service station or a delicatessen. So they really don't remove food out of its packaging when they serve it. It's almost like it comes in the packaging, it's heated in the packaging, and it's delivered in the packaging. Category 1 is more of a catering or a food service. So definitely a tuck shop. And it's where you process unpackaged, potentially hazardous food into a food or a meal that is also then a potentially hazardous food and a ready-to-eat food. Good example are takeaway outlets, caterers, tuck shops. If you've got any further questions around that, more than happy to give you more information under what is under the standard. But that's just in a nutshell. That's what it is. There is a link at the bottom of this screen, and at the end of this network meeting, I'll send you a copy of the slides, but I'll also just send you all the links that I've provided, so you don't have to worry about whether the slides work or not as well. Now, in terms of the food handler training, the big changes are that anyone who does need to comply with this standard is anyone handling food within a business now needs the skills and knowledge to handle potentially hazardous foods. So that means that, oh, I've just got to admit someone else. So that now means that all staff and all volunteers now need to have a food handler training. So they need to undergo that training at some point. Whether now, if they're current staff, it's just about trying to get them trained up as quickly as possible. But it's for new staff coming in, they need to have it before they start. And that's probably the big shift, is making sure that people have it before they start. Now, we do offer something online via our website. It's 15 minutes, and we've been doing that for a long time with the volunteers in Tuckshops. And we found that that's been a really useful tool for Tuckshop conveners to be able to make sure that their volunteers are at least trained up in the very basics of food handling. In terms of food safety supervision requirements, the big thing is you need to have at least one or more food safety supervisor on site, and whether you need one or more really depends on the days that you're operating and who holds the food safety certificate and how many days they operate. The biggest change, though, is that these food safety certificates now expire after 5 years. So if you did do your training in 2018 or earlier, by the end of this year, it will have expired and you will need to recomplete the training. So even if you're looking at, if you got your certification in 2019 and it was early on in the year, you might look at trying to redo your certification before it expires. And that is for state schools or non-state schools. So this is individually for anyone who has the food safety supervision certificate. So this doesn't, it's irrelevant of what school you work at. This is, if you want your certificate in food safety supervision to remain current, you must redo that training every 5 years. And the other big thing with that is that records of this training completion need to be available upon request from the compliance officer, which is the local government, at any stage should they require it. That's probably the big things from a training perspective. From a food safety supervisor, just going back over what that means, it's someone who has the advanced food safety skills and knowledge. You must have the authority to supervise and give directions about matters relating to food safety to people who, oh, my mouse does this sometimes, sorry, who handle food in the food business. So basically, you as the convener obviously have staff that work in the tuck shop and under your direction. So that for you is a really good example of someone who is a food safety supervisor. So it's really important that you can be certified in that supervision so that you have that to demonstrate that you are all about making sure that the food in your tuck shop is being handled safely by not just yourself, but for the staff working there. In terms of what a food safety supervisor is, and there's a few words on here, but every licensed business must have a food safety supervisor. That's the category 1, category 2 thing that we spoke about earlier. Other licensed food businesses are recommended to have a food safety supervisor. And we'll talk about why that's important for state schools in a second. But the big thing is, and this is where I was getting to before, around the 5 days a week, or not the 5 days a week, but the days of operation that the tuck shop is open and the days of work, the days that the individual who is certified works. So basically you need to have someone who's available on a day-to-day basis who can be reasonably available to advise and supervise each food handler. So that's something that's probably more, it was probably less transparent previously, but they've really reinforced that now that it's that day-to-day operations. And you can have more than one supervisor. In terms of training and certification, so this is what the Act actually says. So it's just what I've said before, but it's reinforcing that a food safety supervisor is someone who holds a food safety supervisor certificate that has been issued within the immediately preceding period of 5 years. So that does mean, because this comes into effect on the 8th of December this year. So if you did get your training certificate done prior to that, then you will need to, it will be expired by the time 8th of December happens. And then it's just about looking at the date to see when it expires next. And the big thing is you need to complete the certification. It's not about doing a refresher course. It's actually about doing the full certification again. And this affects everyone who has a food safety supervisor certificate, and anyone operating a licensable category 1 or category 2 food business. And as I said before, Tuckshops really are within that category 1 for food businesses. Oh, Diana, Mary Mac, lovely to have you. Sorry, I thought you were Diane from Sunshine Coast. My apologies, Diana. That's awesome. I will update that because I had the wrong Diana here. Now, in terms of who it applies to, we've kind of gone through this. The big thing I wanted to mention on this slide, and why I've reiterated again, is that it is recommended that food safety supervisors obtain a certification, whether or not you're compliant with the Act. So if you're exempt under this new standard, it's still recommended that you get the certification in Food Safety Supervisor. And the big thing is, particularly for non-state schools, that you speak to your local government for advice, because the way that because they are the compliance officers for the food standards, and they will be the ones that will be coming in to assess and audit your, like the tuck shop, if you need to comply with the Food Safety Act. And we're finding that across different local governments, it really depends on how they interpret what a tuck shop is and the type of food service that it delivers. So it's really important that you have a conversation with your local council just to understand the nuances of how they deem it and how they approach it. And then finally, on the record keeping arm of things, so record keeping, particularly for the non-state schools, you would be well aware that there's a lot of record keeping that comes around food safety. This standard seeks to, I think, to further clarify what is required under this record keeping, particularly around potentially hazardous foods, and what stages do they become potentially hazardous. So there's this little flow chart which is really quite helpful, and that's online. And I'll send you the links to this later, so you can easily have a look at this later. And it really defines about whether record keeping is required or whether it's not required. The other thing is it's really around that ready to eat food versus potentially hazardous food. So the things that you just simply reheat straight in from the packaging and don't ever take it out probably don't need to have their records kept as strenuously as it does show in this little mind map. But in the potentially hazardous food, there is a level of record keeping that is now required, and it's about 3 months that you need to keep these records for now. So if you've got any questions about that, I'm more than happy to answer those for you. We've got a team of people here at Quast, and we've been burrowing ourselves into the food safety standards so that we can better understand what all this means for particularly non-state schools, just so that we can provide that advice for you. In terms of the record keeping that's required, again, if you're from a non-state school, you'll be familiar with this. From a state school point of view, this is kind of making sure that it's best practice for you guys, but this is what they require for record keeping under the standard. And these are just activities can include. So again, speak to your local council about what they require for your compliance. But generally speaking, it's around temperature control during food receipt, food storage. It's about minimizing time during food processing, cooling the food, reheating the food, temperature control during food display, temperature control during food transport to the children, and cleaning and sanitizing. They're all the things that you need to be able to demonstrate that you're keeping a record of how you are actually completing these food safety activities. In terms of tuck shops, and this is probably the big thing, state schools are currently exempt from the Food Act. So that means that these new requirements don't necessarily apply to state schools. So you are exempt. Sorry, I'm just going to take a drink of water. Therefore, it's not mandatory by law to have the qualified food safety supervisor on site when operating the tuck shop within state schools. But the Act does say very clearly, and that was the big thing that had the big yellow bubble on it before, it said while not mandatory, it is highly recommended that state schools adopt a best practice approach to food safety handling. So I'll just take you back. I just want to take you back to that slide, that one here. So while it might not be a requirement or mandatory, it is heavily recommended that you still get that certification, because it's really important that if you are serving food, that you are able to demonstrate that you have the required level of skill and knowledge to be a food safety supervisor. And QOS has always advocated for that anyway, with regards to how we engage with Tuckshops. We have been offering food safety supervisor training for several years. And in terms of the best practice and how we manage that, the best practice requirements really follow that list that we spoke about before for the ones that do need to comply. It may not be as onerous, but it's still the same elements. And I always think of it as like a life cycle of food, that it's like purchasing the goods, receiving the goods, storing the goods, whether they're frozen or not frozen. Then it's, if they're frozen, it's how you thaw those goods out. It's how you clean and sanitize the space before you start preparing the meals. And then it's about the cooking. And then if you, cooling the food down, what are the temperatures for cooling that food? If you're reheating, hot holding. So if you do make food, how do you store it when it is hot? So what are you doing around that? Serving and display of the food is really important, particularly in Tuckshops, particularly primary schools, where we're often sending the food out to the classrooms. And that method of transport is really important. So it's just about demonstrating that you've thought about all of these steps when you are dealing with food safety in the Tuckshop. And we're not asking you to do a food safety plan that might be required for the non-state schools, and for other food retail businesses, but at least in the Tuckshop, it's about understanding the life cycle of the food while it's in your care within that Tuckshop, to make sure that you are sort of honouring and mirroring that best practice requirements. And we'll get into a few things in a minute, but I think the big thing I wanted to talk about is we've noticed some changes in other state schools in other jurisdictions. So in South Australia and Western Australia, state schools are required to have a food safety supervisor on site every day. The Tuckshop is open, so they're no longer exempt from the Food Safety Act. So that's probably the big thing to note, is that it's not unheard of for state schools to need to comply with the Food Safety Act. So it's really important that we are still honouring those best practice requirements in Queensland. There's no update from the Department of Education or Health if these will apply in Queensland. I do want to stress that. But it is really important that if we're updating and we're getting our skill set up to speed and we're delivering best practice in our Tuckshops, then if the changeover did occur, then it's not a major shock and we don't have to change all of the operations in the school. But more importantly, we're just actually making sure that we're delivering food safely to the children and it's being prepared in a safe way that won't make us or them sick. And that's probably the big thing it comes down to, is like we're all about preparing food for children. So we need to make sure that we're actually doing that to the best of our ability. In terms of non-state schools, so this is by and large, non-state schools are not exempt. So you do need to comply with the Food Safety Act. So this would be nothing new for the individuals and the schools where you've had to apply already and you have the council come out and they do an audit of your kitchen. So this is nothing new for you, except for the fact that there's a little bit more rigor around the training and the record management. So food handler training, so that does mean that everyone on site now working in your Tuckshops must have that food handler training. They must be able to present a certificate to demonstrate that they have completed that training. From a food safety supervision point of view, as I was saying before, that certification expires every 5 years, but you must have a food safety supervisor on site every day that Tuckshop is opening. So if it's open for 5 days, but you have a Tuckshop convener that has the certification and she only works for 4, and you have someone else that works on that 5th day, then that person who works on that 5th day must have that supervisor certificate to be for you to be compliant as a food retail business. In Queensland now, that is now required. And that record management as well. So that's sort of that flow chart that we were looking at. So looking at the food that you're delivering and how you're tracking that food, or the ingredients in that food once they arrive into your Tuckshop, how you're storing it, how you're preparing it, how you're cooking it. Because making sure that you're heating food to the correct temperature is really important, but also making sure that you're keeping food to below the correct temperature is really important as well from a food safety point of view, and particularly around contamination of foods. In terms of the food businesses affected, so just to read it, and I might pause here, and just in terms of category 1 food businesses, where do you think you guys sit? Do you think you're definitely category 1, or do you think maybe there might be an element of category 2 food businesses in what you do?
We are definitely category 1.
Yep, definitely category 1, Eric. What sort of meals do you offer out to the students at BBC?
We have 2 daily meals. We cooking our daily meal. Like today is like chicken wing with the rice, plus another one is a nacho. So all the ingredients is prepared by purchase, storage, and made in the Tuckshop. So we're definitely category 1.
Yep, excellent. And what about you, Kim? Oh, you can't talk, Kim. That's fine. I'll move on to Rhonda. Hi, Rhonda. How are you? I saw you sneak in there. What about you, Rhonda? What about for you?
Well, I suppose we probably make most of our food.
Yeah, so so while you're a state school and you're not compliant, you are deemed a category 1 food business. So I think it's just about understanding in terms of the expectation around best practice principles and the requirements. It's about making sure that you're trying to meet the best practice requirements for category 1 food businesses when you're doing anything around food safety within the tuck shop. So, but yeah, that's probably the big thing for Ingham State School would be that. Do you have your food safety certificate at the moment, Rhonda?
Yes.
You do?
Yeah.
And when was the last time that you did the training? Do you remember?
Oh, it's on the wall at school. It would be a few years now. It would be over 5 years. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Actually, I think you and I had this conversation, didn't we? Yeah.
Yeah.
But that's okay. Yeah. So it's just about trying to. Sorry.
I've done it through Australian quarantine, and I've done it through the council, and I've done it through the health. So I think it'll have to be redone.
Yeah, it sounds like it will be, unfortunately, because I think now it's irrespective of the provider. It's that time frame now is what seems to kick it into needing to redo it. So, which is challenging, I think. But at least it's not every 2 years. It could have been worse. I think it could have been every 2 years. So every 5 years at least gives everyone a bit of breathing space in between. Diana, what about yourself? What sort of practice in terms of a food business do you think you mirror in your tuck shop?
Well, we make a lot of things, like pre-make them, like the butter chicken and rice, and then we have to cool it, then store it, we freeze it. We've got the mac and cheese that we also make, and then we're just prepping like the burgers, and then we've got the chicken wraps that we have to all prepare and just make sure we we prepare them, and then once the hot food's ready to go out, we make them up and send them out in the baskets. So yeah, there is a lot of food handling that we have to make sure that the food isn't going cold and sitting there before it goes out. So
yeah, that is, and I think that's the big thing, isn't it? It's understanding that we sit in that category 1, and that's almost like they rate that as like the high risk category with tuck shops, to make sure that we're actually making that food safely. And there is always a lot of food handling, particularly in, I think, with the meals that we make these days, those production line items. There's just so many areas of risk with relating to the food that we use, and how long they're out and about. Now, I did want to go through some examples as well, in terms of I think you guys have got it, so I won't sort of labor on these too much. But in terms of do you want to say something in terms of an exemption? So this is a Catholic for-profit school, so non-state school, for-profit, operates their tuck shop on 12 days or less. So they only are open 1 day a month, with the sale of meals prepared at the place, and they would not need a license regardless of where or how the food is prepared. And that the key thing there, even though they are a Catholic for-profit school, is because they're operating on 12 or less days. So that's something to remember. That's really important as well. It's about the number of days you're operating. Now, I think we would all qualify in terms of, I don't think it's only very rarely that I see a tuck shop that's open 1 day a week. I can't remember the last time I ran into a tuck shop that was operating once a month. But there is that kind of, if your tuck shop, for example, if your school doesn't have a tuck shop, but it does special events, they don't need a food license. That was a question that came up a couple of weeks ago around the fact that the tuck shop had closed down, but they did want to run events. So they are still exempt because it's less than 12 a year. In terms of what's defined as a meal is really interesting under the Food Safety Act. So for example, it's a meal means something that is or intended to be eaten by a person sitting at a table or a fixed structure used as a table with cutlery and is of adequate substance as to be ordinarily accepted as a meal. And this is why it's really important for all those schools that do need to comply with the Food Safety Act, that they have a chat to their local councils, because this is where we're finding sometimes the councils are interpreting this differently, or they're misunderstanding the type of meals that are being delivered at a tuck shop. So it's really important that you have that conversation with them around and show them your menu and talk them through about the food safety concerns you may have, or the food practices that you have in preparing the meals. And for example, they do say a sandwich will not be defined as a meal, but I would say like a spaghetti bolognese, for example, is of adequate substance and is ordinarily accepted as a meal. One, you would need cutlery to do it. They may not be sitting at a table for children because that's not always possible, but they definitely do need cutlery to eat that. So because you are serving that type of food, then you would note that that is deemed a meal, and then it's compliant, and then you need to comply. So, but it's really important to talk to local council if you are confused or worried about what some of the changes might be. In terms of another example, Catholic school tuck shop, not for profit. So it operates 2 days a week, makes some meals in-house and has some pre-purchased foods on the menu. Because they are not for profit, they would also be exempt. And that's probably the key thing between the last school example and this school example, is it's a not-for-profit Catholic school, so non-state school, but it's deemed not-for-profit. But again, talk to your local council, because we have had different councils providing us with different information on this as well. And it's all about that interpretation. All right, guys. Well, thank you for bearing with us with that. I thought that was really informative. I learned something new again in that session. So there you go. Every time I hear Alicia talk about chemicals, I learn something new. So in terms of just finishing off for the day and what's required, I think the big thing is just to remind yourselves that everyone who has a Food Safety Supervisor certificate must have it 5 years or younger for it to still be compliant. Otherwise, it does expire under the new requirements, and those new requirements are coming in on the 8th of December this year. Really important in a non-state school that does need to comply with the Food Act, that you make sure that all of your staff and volunteers have completed food handling training. Also recommended for everyone, just to make sure, just to check with your staff to see if they would be interested in at least completing some free food handling training. At least then you can keep that certificate and keep that on hand, so that you can feel, or that you know that the staff that you're working with within your tuck shop have some level of competency around food handling. For state schools, really important, whilst you're not compliant, while you're exempt from the Food Safety Act, it's really important that you still review your current food handling practices. And I think, just listening, it sort of always flags, oh, I should think about this or do that. And Kyle, you raised some really good points around the chemicals and everything that's going on. So I'm definitely going to be looking into that a little bit more. So maybe just have a think about how you are currently operating and how you're going against best practice. And if there's little easy things that you might be able to do at the moment, like the low-hanging fruit that you might be able to look at. And if you do require more training, if you feel more is needed for you or your staff, please do reach out, because we do offer training for everyone. For non-state schools, I think that's a big thing. It's if you have always had to have, or if council have always sort of audited your tuck shop, that will continue, but there will be new requirements under that auditing process. So do double check with that local council in terms of what those requirements will be. It will, at a high level, obviously, it's the training requirements and making sure you're keeping all of those on file so that they can provide it as required, making sure you have a food safety supervisor on site every single day, and also with your record. So that's probably the big thing, is the record keeping. Really make sure that you're recording what you need to do with regards to the food that's coming in, how it's being stored, how it's being prepared, how it's being cooked, how it's being heated, and how it's being served, and then how it is being transported are probably the big things. And then at the end of the day, it's all the cleaning and sanitizing that we do within the tuck shop to make sure that we can come back the next day and start again. But always reach out to the local council if you do have any questions about their actual requirements for your school specifically. In terms of just the really high level stuff, obviously, any tuck shop convener or manager that holds a Food Safety Supervisor certificate will need to renew that certification any tuck shops operated by P&C and also school administrations, because the Act doesn't specify that, but we've clarified that it's P&C associations and all school administrations within state schools are exempt, and all non-state schools are required, but exemptions do apply if you're a not-for-profit and in other circumstances, so please do talk to your local council. We are offering some food safety training for those that are worried about their certification and if it has expired or about to expire. We have 4 more dates, the September 7th, October 12, November 7, November 21, and also what's not on there is we've actually just put up a new course for September the 21st, which is during school holidays. So that might also be helpful if you're finding time trying to get out of term time and you would like to do the training in the school holidays. Please do go online to our website and have a look there under the training and events section. You can find those dates there, and it's really easy to register. Pop it through and then we can get back to you, or just send me an email if you're not sure and you would like me to send you links. I'm more than happy to do that. There's a couple of links here. There's more throughout the presentation, which I'll email you through, but that's about it. If you have any other inquiries, these are our general office hours. That's the office line, that's the admin line, but please do reach out and speak to me directly if you would like to. It's donna@quas.org.au.